Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. The map was not finished. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed when she unrolled it across the wide oak table in her uncle's study. Not the quality of the ink, not the precision of the coastlines, not the extraordinary detail of the mountain ranges drawn with a hand so steady it might have belonged to a machine rather than a man. The first thing she noticed was that it stopped. Midway across the eastern edge, the coastline simply ended. The ink trailed off into nothing, as though the cartographer had paused to consider something and never returned. Eleanor Ainsley was 32 years old. She lived in a small coastal town in Dorset, in a house with 4 rooms and a window that faced the sea. She was a school teacher, walking the same road each morning, stopping at the same corner, teaching the same children with the same patience. Her life was quiet, the sort of quiet that others might have found dull, but which had always felt sufficient to Eleanor. There was an order in quietness, a safety in repetition. She had never needed more than what the day provided, and the days, in their faithful way, had always provided enough. Her uncle, Edmund Ainsley, had not been a quiet man, he had been a man who preferred quiet, which is a very different thing. He had spent 40 years with the Ordnance Survey, mapping every corner of England with the particular devotion of a man who believed that the world deserved to be recorded accurately and completely. He had walked every ridge, measured every contour, followed every river to its source and back again, and committed all of it to paper with the steady, unhurried hand that Eleanor remembered from childhood visits, the hand that moved across the page like water finding its own level, never forced, never hesitant, simply certain. His maps were not merely accurate. They were beautiful. Not in the decorative sense, Edmund had no patience for embellishment, but in the deeper sense of things made with complete attention. A coastline drawn by Edmund Ainsley looked like a coastline. It carried the weight of the actual shore, the particular curve of a headland shaped by centuries of tide, the precise indentation of a cove where the rock had surrendered to the sea at exactly the rate the sea had demanded. Looking at his maps, you did not simply know where things were. You understood why they were there. Edmund had died on the 14th of November. Peacefully, in his study, with a pen in his hand and a map half-drawn before him. The solicitor's letter had been brief and without sentiment, as solicitors' letters tend to be. He had left the house, the study, and everything within it to his niece Eleanor, whom he had not seen in 7 years but had written to every month without fail, letters that arrived with the regularity of tides and contained, without exception, exactly one sentence: "The work continues, and I hope you are well." Eleanor had thought about that sentence on the train from Dorset to Devon. The work continues. What work? Edmund had retired from the Ordnance Survey 15 years ago. He had purchased this house in the Devon countryside and had, by all appearances, withdrawn entirely from the wider world. When Eleanor had visited, 7 years ago, in midsummer, on a day when the flowers were in bloom and the garden was full of light, her uncle had greeted her warmly but distractedly. His eyes kept drifting toward the study door. His hands moved restlessly on the table, as though searching for something invisible. A person could be in the same room as another person and still be somewhere else entirely. Edmund, on that day, had been exactly that. Now Eleanor stood in that study. It was late November. She had arrived by train that morning, then by hired cart from the station, travelling the narrow Devon lanes that wound between hedgerows still holding the last of their autumn colour, not the bright golds and reds of October, but the deeper, quieter tones of November, the browns and rusts and that particular dark amber that appears when leaves have accepted their falling but have not yet let go. The cart driver had been a quiet man who spoke only to his horse, which suited Eleanor well. She had watched the landscape pass in its unhurried way, field after field divided by stone walls that looked as though they had grown from the earth rather than been placed upon it. The house stood at the end of a lane, behind a low wall and a wooden gate that opened smoothly, as though it had been recently oiled. The building itself was of local stone, grey-gold, the colour of winter sunlight on lichen. With a slate roof and small windows that looked out onto the garden with the patient expression of a house accustomed to keeping its own company. The garden had gone to seed in the way gardens do when their keeper has been absent, not neglected, exactly, but allowed to make its own decisions. The rose by the front door had sent out one last bloom, pale and slightly bewildered, as though it had not received the memorandum about winter. Eleanor had let herself in with the solicitor's key. The hallway was narrow and dark, the air carrying the particular coolness of a house that has not been heated in weeks, not damp, not hostile, simply waiting. She had walked through the sitting room, the kitchen, the small bedroom downstairs, learning the house by its sounds and smells before she reached the study at the back, the room where Edmund had spent 15 years doing whatever it was he had been doing. Outside, the Devon countryside had dressed itself in its particular winter grey. The sky neither bright nor dark, simply undecided, as though the weather had not yet committed to a position on the matter. The house was cold. The fire had not been lit. The air smelled of old stone and wood and something else, something sharper, more immediate. Ink. The study smelled of ink. Not the faint, apologetic smell of ink that has dried and been forgotten, but the living smell of ink recently used, sharp, mineral, almost metallic. As though someone had been working here minutes rather than weeks ago. Edmund had been dead for 19 days. The ink on the map spread across his table carried a freshness that had no reasonable explanation. Eleanor noted this. She filed it at the edge of her mind without attempting to explain it, simply noticing, the way one notices that the light has changed quality without stopping to measure the angle of the sun. Edmund had taught her this, perhaps without meaning to. Observe before you interpret, he used to say. Conclusions arrived at prematurely contaminate the observation. First look. Then think. Eleanor looked. The study was not large, but it was full, the sort of fullness that accumulates over decades of sustained attention to a single subject. Maps lined the walls in frames of varying age and condition, some clearly official, the precise, authoritative products of the Ordnance Survey, others less formal, pinned with tacks, their edges curling. A bookcase occupied half of the far wall, its shelves dense with volumes on cartography, geography, geology, and natural history, their spines cracked from use rather than neglect. A small fireplace stood cold and clean against the interior wall, its stones carrying the faint memory of warmth. A pair of worn leather gloves lay on the mantelpiece beside a magnifying glass and a compass whose brass had been polished smooth by decades of handling. And on the table, at the center of everything, the map. Eleanor approached it slowly. The map was large, perhaps 4 feet across and 3 feet tall, drawn on heavy paper of the sort used for documents intended to endure. The paper had a particular quality beneath her fingers when she touched it, slightly rough, substantial, the kind of paper that takes ink seriously and holds it without complaint. The ink was black. Edmund's black, the particular shade he had always used, neither too dark nor too light, a black that sat on the page with both authority and modesty. The map depicted a landmass. But it resembled no landmass Eleanor recognized. The coastlines matched no published atlas she had ever consulted. There were mountain ranges and rivers and valleys and plains, and small, precisely rendered symbols marking what appeared to be settlements. Everything was drawn with Edmund's unmistakable hand. That steady, fluid, utterly confident line that moved across the page as though it were simply revealing what had always been there, rather than creating something new. And at the eastern edge, it stopped. Eleanor traced her finger to the point where the coastline ended. The ink thinned there, the particular thinning that marks a deliberate pause, the moment when a pen is lifted from paper with intention rather than accident. Edmund had stopped here. He had chosen to stop, or he had been required to stop, and Eleanor did not yet know which. Beside the table, to the left of the map, a notebook lay closed. Dark green cloth binding, the year written on the spine in Edmund's small, precise hand, 1887. Eleanor picked it up and opened it to the first page. March the 7th. I am beginning today. A study I have long postponed, perhaps my entire career. The survey required maps of real places, and for 40 years I drew maps of real places. But between the real places, I always saw other places as well. Not imaginary places, places not yet mapped. Places that exist at the corner of the eye, that vanish when looked at directly. A valley that should be behind a hill but is not. A direction a river should flow but does not. I noted these over the years. Small inconsistencies. Small impossibilities. I am retired now, and I have time at last. I am beginning the map. Eleanor lowered the notebook to her knee and looked at the map. Then back at the notebook. Edmund Ainsley, the most meticulous, the most rational, the most dependable cartographer the Ordnance Survey had ever employed, had spent the 15 years of his retirement drawing a map of a place that did not exist. Or rather, a place he believed existed. She sat down in the chair beside the table, Edmund's chair, she realized, from the particular wear on the armrests, the slight depression in the seat that matched a body accustomed to long hours of sitting. She sat where Edmund had sat, in front of the map Edmund had drawn, holding the notebook Edmund had written in, and she felt, not his presence, nothing so dramatic as that, but his absence. The particular shape of a person who is no longer in a room but who has left behind the imprint of their attention, the way a seal leaves its mark in wax. The room remembered Edmund. The chair remembered him. The map, most of all, remembered him. Outside, the Devon countryside was darkening. November evenings arrived early here, the horizon passing through grey to blue-grey to that particular deep navy that precedes the appearance of stars, the last colour the sky wears before committing fully to night. Eleanor turned the lamp on. A warm, yellow light spread across the room. The ink on the map looked different in this light. deeper, more alive, as though it were not fixed upon the paper but floating just above it, catching the lamplight and holding it the way old glass holds light, concentrating it, making it warmer than it has any right to be. She opened the notebook again and continued reading. The notebooks numbered 14. All the same size, all bound in the same dark green cloth, each bearing a year on its spine in Edmund's hand, 1887, 1888, 1889, continuing forward to 1901. 15 years. The final notebook bore the year of Edmund's death. Eleanor removed them from the study shelf one by one, carefully, maintaining their order. She placed them on the table beside the map, a row of silent witnesses, each one carrying Edmund's observations, his thoughts, his slowly evolving understanding of what he was doing and why. The green cloth bindings were slightly worn at the edges, softened by years of handling, and each notebook bore a faint indentation on the front cover where Edmund's thumb had rested as he wrote, the same spot on each one, the same habit repeated across 15 years. Eleanor touched the indentation on the first notebook. His thumb had pressed here. His hand had held this exact object in this exact way, hundreds of times. The intimacy of it caught her off guard, more personal, somehow, than reading his words. She began with the first. She turned the pages slowly, reading at the pace the entries themselves suggested. Some long, some brief, some occupying half a page with the close, attentive handwriting of a man who had seen something that demanded full recording. Edmund's voice emerged from the pages with a clarity that startled her, that calm, measured, never-raised voice, the voice of a man who meant exactly what he said and trusted that exactness would be sufficient. April 3rd, 1887. I have begun the coastline. The western shore. I chose Blackmere Point as my starting reference. Not a real point, of course, but 30 years ago, while mapping in Cornwall, I stood on a particular headland looking out to sea, and I noticed a discrepancy between the coastline to my right and the coastline to my left. A small thing. A matter of degrees. But to a cartographer, a matter of degrees is a matter of continents. I noted the discrepancy. I wrote in my field journal that day, something is missing here. Today I am beginning to draw what is missing. Eleanor turned the page. April 17th. The western coastline is taking shape. I have noticed something interesting. The coastline I am drawing is not a line I am imagining or inventing. It is more like a line I am remembering. When my pen touches the paper, it moves as though it knows where to go. I am not discovering. I am uncovering. The distinction is important. Eleanor read this entry twice. I am uncovering. Edmund was not inventing a place. He was committing to paper a place that already existed but could not be seen. Or so he believed. Whether his belief was delusion or perception, Eleanor could not yet determine. She moved to the second notebook. The second notebook covered 1888. Edmund's entries had grown longer, more detailed. He had moved from the coastline to the interior, beginning to draw the mountain ranges. June 8th, 1888. The northern mountains are complete as of today. While drawing them, I experienced something I must record. As I determined the height and gradient of the peaks, I closed my eyes and received, quite distinctly, the smell of mountain stone. Granite and rain and moss. I cannot explain how this occurred. I was sitting in my study. The window was closed. but the smell was present, briefly, and then it vanished. Eleanor might expect me to dismiss this as fancy. I would prefer to dismiss it myself. But the smell was real. My pen paused, and then, after the scent had passed, I drew the remainder of the mountains in a single sitting, as though someone had shown me the way. Eleanor's heart quickened slightly. There was something in these lines she recognized, the particular tone of a scientist recording an experience he cannot account for, neither denying nor accepting, simply documenting. Edmund had spent his life trusting the observable world. He was suspicious of embellishment, impatient with imprecision. And here, in his own notebook, in his own careful hand, he was writing about impossible scents arriving in a closed room on a summer afternoon in Devon. She continued through the pages. Outside, night had fallen completely. The lamp burned steadily on the table. The house was silent around her, that particular silence of old houses at night, composed not of absence but of small, familiar sounds, wood contracting in the cold, pipes settling, wind whispering at the edges of window frames. Not silence at all, really. A house's own language, spoken only when no one is trying to listen. Eleanor rose briefly to light the fire in the study grate. She found matches on the mantelpiece and coal in a scuttle beside the hearth. The fire took hold slowly, reluctantly at first, as fires do in rooms that have been cold for too long, then with growing confidence, the flames finding their rhythm, the coal beginning to glow with that particular deep red that promises warmth without demanding attention. The room changed around the fire. Shadows retreated to the corners. The air softened. The map on the table seemed to settle into itself, as though it had been waiting for warmth before fully revealing its character. She returned to her chair. The fire crackled once, then subsided into the steady, companionable sound of a well-behaved fire that understands its role is not to entertain but to accompany. The Third Notebook. 1889. February the 21st. I have begun the rivers. Rivers are the most honest elements of cartography. A river cannot lie, because you need only follow the water. But the rivers on this map surprise me. The main river, I have not yet named it, naming will come later, flows in a direction I did not expect. Where it should run east, it curves southeast, passing through a valley before turning east again. The curve appears illogical, until one considers the geological formation that would cause it. If a particular type of rock formation exists at that point, the river would flow exactly as I have drawn it. And I had not yet drawn the geology. The river told me its geology. Eleanor rose from the table. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle. While the water heated, she stood at the window and looked out at the garden, invisible now in the darkness, only the faint shape of the apple tree and, far away, the single lit window of a neighboring farmhouse, small and yellow in the distance. She made tea and carried it back to the study, moving through the darkened house with the careful steps of someone learning a new space, not yet knowing which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck. The Fourth Notebook. 1890. October the 12th. Something happened today that I must record. I was drawing a bay in the southwest corner of the map, a small, sheltered bay, enclosed by cliffs. When my pen touched the paper, I felt warmth in my fingertips. Sunlight warmth. My study was cold, it is October, the fire was not lit. But my fingers were warm, as though they were resting on a sun-heated stone. And for a moment, a very brief moment, I heard the sea. Waves striking rocks. That particular rhythm, that coming and going. Then it passed. But I drew the bay in that moment, and I knew that what I had drawn was correct. Correct is the right word. Not imagined. Not guessed. Known. Eleanor read this entry and noticed that her hands were trembling. Slightly. Not from the weight of the notebook, from the weight of Edmund's words. The man she had known her entire life, rational, measured, every observation grounded in verifiable fact, was here, in his own handwriting, describing impossible sensory experiences. And he was doing so without shame or defensiveness. He was simply recording, as he had always done. Writing down what he observed, what he heard, what he felt, exactly as it was. The 5th, 6th, 7th notebooks. The years advanced. The map grew. Edmund had begun filling in the interior, forests, plains, lakes. With each entry, the map became a little more complete, and Edmund's language shifted a little further. More lyrical. More personal. Less the detached observer, more the engaged participant. March the 4th, 1893. While drawing the forest today, I understood something. This map is my life's work, but it is not my work. I am merely the recorder. Someone somewhere is transferring something to paper, and I am the instrument of that transfer. I do not find this arrogant. I find it humbling. A cartographer at his best steps aside and allows the terrain to speak for itself. I did this for 40 years with real terrain. Now I am doing the same with terrain that cannot be seen. August the 19th, 1893. I have been thinking about the nature of places. A place exists because someone notices it. A mountain, until someone looks at it, is merely an accumulation of rock. A river, until someone follows it, is merely water in motion. The act of mapping is the act of bringing a place into existence, seeing it, attending to it, recording it. The act of noticing. I have spent my life noticing. I do not intend to stop. The 6th notebook contained an entry that made Eleanor pause for a long time. February the 14th, 1892. Today I drew the lake in the Central Valley. It is not large, perhaps 2 miles across at its widest point, but it is deep. I know this without being able to explain how I know it. The ink behaved differently when I drew the lake. It spread more slowly, as though the paper itself were absorbing it with greater care, as though the weight of water, even imagined water, even ink water, demanded a different kind of attention. When I finished, I sat back and looked at it, and I felt, this is difficult to express, I felt that the lake was looking back. Not with eyes, of course. Lakes do not have eyes. But with the particular attention that deep water gives to everything that stands beside it. The attention of reflection. Of holding an image and returning it, changed. May the 9th, 1892. I wrote to Eleanor today. My monthly letter. The same sentence as always. I wonder sometimes if she reads them with attention or merely glances and sets them aside. It does not matter. The letters are not for reading. They are for continuity. A thread between two people who do not need to speak often but who need to remain connected. Like a river that runs underground for miles and emerges, unchanged, in a different field. The connection is not visible. It is nonetheless real. Eleanor set this notebook down and looked at her hands for a long time. Her hands, which had opened these notebooks, which had unrolled the map, which had touched the same paper Edmund had touched. She thought about the letters. Every month for 15 years. 180 letters, each containing exactly one sentence. She had read them, she had always read them. But she had read them quickly, with the casual attention one gives to things that are expected and therefore unremarkable. She had not understood that each letter was a heartbeat. A steady, faithful pulse, sent across the distance between Devon and Dorset, saying simply, "I am still here." The thread holds. She picked up the 7th notebook. 1893. Eleanor closed the 8th notebook and leaned back. It was well past midnight. The lamp still burned. The map lay on the table in its half-finished state, and in the lamplight, it seemed almost to breathe, the ink lines carrying a depth that went beyond the surface of the paper, as though the mountains truly rose and the rivers truly flowed and the coastline truly curved along the edge of an actual shore. She needed sleep. She would continue in the morning. But she looked at the map one more time, a final glance, the way one looks at something before saying good night. And that was when she saw it. At the point where the coastline ended, at the eastern edge, where Edmund's pen had lifted and not returned, there was something that had not been there before. A small mark. A point. Made in ink, fresh, the same particular black that Edmund had always used. Eleanor leaned closer. The point was the beginning of something, a line, a continuation of the coastline. It had not been there yesterday. She was certain of that. She had studied the eastern edge carefully when she first unrolled the map. The coastline had ended cleanly, the ink trailing to nothing. Now there was a point. And from that point, the faintest suggestion of a line extending forward. Edmund had been dead for 19 days. The ink was fresh. Eleanor straightened. Her heart beat very quietly, very steadily in her chest. She looked at the map. She looked at the point. She looked at the row of notebooks on the table. Then she went to the kitchen, made another cup of tea, and waited for morning. Morning arrived early, or rather, Eleanor rose early, which was more accurate. She had slept poorly. During the brief intervals when sleep had come, some part of her mind had remained in the study, beside the table, beside the map, beside that small fresh point of ink at the eastern edge. She did not eat breakfast. She went directly to the study. The point was still there. But it was no longer merely a point. A line had extended from it, short, perhaps half an inch, but unmistakably a line. The continuation of the coastline. Drawn from where Edmund had stopped, in that particular precision, in that particular ink, with the steady hand that Eleanor would have recognized anywhere. Eleanor stood over the map for a long time. She was not thinking, or she was thinking, but was not certain that what was happening in her mind qualified as thought. It was more like observation. An interior observation of the kind Edmund had taught her, first look, then think. She looked. The line was there. It was real. The ink was fresh. Then she thought. And what she thought was this: Edmund's notebooks were not yet finished. She had stopped at the 8th notebook the previous night. 6 more remained. Perhaps the answer was there, perhaps not, but Edmund was a cartographer, and cartographers left their traces in their maps and in the records they kept alongside them. She took up the 9th notebook. 1895. January the 16th. Winter is the best season for cartography. There are no competing distractions, no garden, no walks, no visitors. Only the table and the paper and the ink and the land waiting to be drawn. This winter I have begun the settlements. Towns, villages. I hesitated over this, to name a places to claim it, and was I in a position to claim? But the map asked for names. At certain points my pen would pause, and I would feel the necessity of a name being there, not the name itself, but the requirement of a name's presence. February the 2nd. The first name arrived today. The largest settlement, the one at the center of the map, where the river curves and the valley widens. My hand trembled as I wrote it. Not from excitement, from recognition. I had heard this name before. Where or when, I cannot say. But as my pen formed the letters, I noticed my mouth shaping them silently, as though I were remembering rather than inventing. Eleanor searched the map for the settlement. She found it at the center, where the river curved. Written in small, precise letters, Aylminster. She said the word quietly to herself. It carried the sound of English place names, the suffix minster, from the Old English for monastery or church. But Flail was unfamiliar. She had not encountered it in any English place name she knew. She moved through the notebooks more quickly now, not skimming. Eleanor did not skim, but reading with a focused attention that carried her through the pages at the pace the story demanded. The 10th notebook. 1896. July the 21st. Eleanor visited today. Eleanor stopped. This was the visit 7 years ago. Edmund continued. It was good to see Eleanor. But I could not show her the map. I wanted to, very much. But it is not yet ready. Not the map, Eleanor. I do not say this in any arrogant or dismissive sense. Eleanor is an intelligent and observant woman. But some things require preparation. Reading a map requires knowing the map's language. And the language of this particular map is one that takes time to learn. Eleanor's time will come. I know this. I do not know why I know it, but as a cartographer I have always known certain things before I could account for them, where a coastline will turn, where a river will widen. Some knowledge arrives before logic. This is not a failing of knowledge. It is a feature of it. Eleanor read this entry 3 times. Her eyes were not wet, or if they were, she did not admit it to herself. Edmund had thought of her. Had wanted to show her the map. And the reason he had not was not condescension but care. He was waiting for her to be ready. And now, 19 days after his death, summoned by a solicitor's letter and a set of keys, here she was. Edmund's timing, in death as in life, had been precise. The 11th notebook. 1897. September the 5th. The map is nearly complete. Only the eastern coastline remains. Curiously, this section is the most difficult, as though the map itself resists completion. As though there is a purpose in being unfinished. An unfinished map is an invitation, come, it says, and continue. A finished map is a closed door, sealed, concluded, no longer open to entry. October the 17th. I understand now the purpose of the notebooks. I did not write them for myself. The person who reads these notebooks, whoever they are, whenever they come, will learn to read the map. Each entry is a lesson. Each observation is a key. The notebooks are the language of the map. Eleanor set the notebook down and made tea. In the kitchen, standing at the window while the kettle boiled, she thought about what she had read. The notebooks are the language of the map. Edmund had written the notebooks not as a record but as a teaching instrument. Each entry carried a piece of knowledge necessary for understanding the map, the scents, the warmth, the sounds. These were not merely Edmund's private experiences. They were evidence of the map's reality, clues left deliberately for the person who would come after him. She thought about languages. She had taught children to read for 10 years. The slow, patient process of matching sounds to symbols, of building words from letters, of understanding that marks on a page could carry meaning across time and distance. Edmund had done the same thing with his notebooks. He had created a language, a particular language, suited to a particular purpose, and he had left the primer for the student who would eventually arrive. The kettle boiled. She poured, stirred, carried the cup to the study. The fire had settled into a low, steady warmth. The room felt inhabited now in a way it had not when she first entered, not by another presence, but by the accumulated attention of hours spent reading, of a mind slowly opening to the possibility that what Edmund had created was not madness but method. And the map was continuing to draw itself. She glanced at the eastern edge. The line was longer. Unmistakably longer. She had not been watching, she had been reading, absorbed in the notebooks. And in that interval of inattention, the coastline had advanced. As Edmund had noted, some things happen only when you are not looking. Some things require privacy to grow. She finished her tea and returned to the study. The line at the eastern edge had grown. It was perhaps an inch long now. A coastline was forming, a small headland, a bay, that particular dance of indentation and protrusion that real coastlines perform where the sea meets resistant rock. Eleanor pulled a chair to the table and Saturday. She opened the 12th notebook. 1898. March the 11th. Today I noticed a change on the map, in the southern forested region. I drew that area months ago. But now there is a path there that was not present before. A thin line running through the forest. A line I did not draw. The map is correcting itself. Or more accurately, the map is growing. Just as real terrain grows, new paths forming, new routes opening, the slow organic development of a landscape that is never truly finished. June the 24th. Other changes as well. A new tributary where the river curves. A pass appearing in the northern mountains. I drew none of these. But all are rendered in Edmund Ainsley's ink, with Edmund Ainsley's precision. This is either a form of madness or evidence that the map exists independently and continues of its own accord. I prefer the latter interpretation, because madness is disorderly, and these additions are supremely orderly. September the 1st, 1898. I have been watching the map more carefully these past weeks, coming down to the study at odd hours, very early in the morning, very late at night, hoping to catch the moment of change. I have not succeeded. The additions appear only when I am not watching, in the intervals between attention, in the spaces where observation pauses to rest. I find this instructive rather than frustrating. Some things happen only in the absence of scrutiny. Some things require privacy to grow. A watched pot, as they say, does not boil. A watched map, it seems, does not draw. Eleanor rose from the chair and leaned over the map. She found the southern forest. And yes, there, running through the trees, a thin line. A path. The one Edmund had described. And beside it, she noticed now, the faintest indication of a clearing. A small open space among the trees where the ink was lighter, as though the forest had stepped back to allow something room. She examined the quality of the line, the tone of the ink, the pressure, the particular fluidity of the stroke, and it was Edmund's hand. Or a hand indistinguishable from Edmund's. Or a hand that shared whatever source Edmund's hand had drawn from. She did not tremble. She was not afraid. Instead, she did what Edmund had always done, she observed. She noted it at the edge of her mind and continued. She found herself moving through the house differently now. Not as a visitor cataloguing someone else's possessions, but as someone beginning to understand the logic of a place. She noticed that the study window faced east, the direction of the unfinished coastline. She noticed that Edmund's chair was positioned so that the first light of morning would fall directly on the map. She noticed that the ink bottle on the table was not quite centered but placed slightly to the right, exactly where a right-hand person would reach for it without looking. Every detail in the room was arranged with the particular intentionality of a man who had thought carefully about his working conditions, who understood that the space in which work is done shapes the work itself. She made lunch, bread and cheese from the provisions the solicitor had arranged, and ate at the kitchen table, looking out at the garden through the window. The November light was at its best now, that low golden hour that arrives in winter when the sun, having barely risen, is already preparing to set. The garden seemed less overgrown in this light. The structures beneath the wildness were visible, the paths Edmund had laid, the beds he had planted, the small stone wall at the far end that separated the cultivated ground from the open field beyond. A robin appeared on the wall, round and red-breasted, regarding her through the glass with the absolute confidence of a creature that knows it belongs exactly where it is. She returned to the study. The 13th Notebook. 1899. January the 2nd. New Year. The map is nearly complete, save the eastern coastline. I am leaving that section deliberately. A conscious decision. I understand now that the map must not be completed. Incompleteness is part of the map's nature. Just as the real world can never be fully mapped. There is always one more corner to discover. One more ridge beyond the ridge you have just recorded. A cartographer's greatest virtue is accepting the limits of the map while never ceasing to extend them. August the 19th. I reviewed the notebooks today. Everything must be clear, everything legible. Because, and I accept this now without reservation, these notebooks are not for me. They are for the person who will come after. The person who will sit at this table, unroll this map, and ask, "What is this?" The notebooks are the map's language. And a language lives as long as there is someone willing to speak it. Eleanor closed the 13th notebook. She picked up the 14th and final notebook. 1901, the last year of Edmund's life. She did not open it immediately. She held it for a while, feeling its weight, the texture of the cloth cover, the slightly raised edges of the pages within. This notebook contained Edmund's final words. His last observations, his last thoughts. Something as personal as a last breath committed to paper. She opened it. January the 4th, 1901. Winter has begun harshly this year. The study is cold, but the map is warm. Or rather, working on the map warms me, which is a more reasonable explanation. I left the eastern coastline 2 years ago. I was right to leave it. The map has begun drawing that section itself. Slowly, each night a little more, a line, a curve, a detail. When I come to the table in the mornings, there is slightly more than there was the evening before. This neither frightens nor surprises me. It is like watching a gardener's seeds sprout. You planted them, but what grows is not you. Eleanor turned the pages. Edmund's entries had shortened, fewer words, more silence between them. The mark of a man conserving the energy available to him, choosing what was most worth recording when recording had become an effort. March the 22nd. Spring is arriving. The crocuses in the garden have opened. A letter from Eleanor, brief, as always. She writes that she is well. I believe she is well. But one day she will come to this house and being well will not be sufficient. One day she will look for meaning. And the map will be here. July the 11th. Warm. I opened the window. The scent of jasmine from the garden, and, curiously, a scent from the map as well. Not jasmine. Something else. Salt. The smell of a place near the sea. The bay in the southwest, it seems to be coming from there. I no longer find this remarkable. I simply note it. September the 30th. Autumn. The leaves are turning. Devon is very beautiful in this season. Gold and amber and that particular dark red that has no good name in English. The map is turning too, not new colors, of course, the black ink remains the same. But something is changing in the map. It looks fuller. More lived in. More itself. October the 22nd. I have been thinking about Eleanor again. About the particular quality of her attention. When she was a child, she would come to visit and sit in my study for hours, not speaking, not asking questions, simply watching me work. Most children cannot do this. Most adults cannot do this. She could. She had the gift of patience, not the forced patience of someone enduring boredom, but the genuine patience of someone who understands that some things reveal themselves only to those willing to wait. I think of her often. I hope she has not lost that gift. I suspect she has not. Gifts like that do not disappear. They are merely set aside, sometimes for years, until the moment they are needed. The pages were thinning. Eleanor turned each one slowly, the way Edmund had looked at everything, with full attention, without haste, allowing each thing to be completely what it was before moving on to the next. The final entry. November the 11th, 1901. I looked at the map for a long time today. There was nothing to draw. The eastern coastline continues drawing itself, slowly, at its own pace. I am only watching now. And as I watch, I think. For 40 years I drew maps of real places. For 15 years I have drawn the map of this place. And I understand now that there is no difference between the two. A place does not exist until someone notices it. A mountain, until someone looks at it, is merely an accumulation of rock. A river, until someone follows it, is merely water in motion. The act of mapping is the act of bringing a place into existence, of seeing it, of attending to it, of recording it. The act of noticing. Does this place on the map exist? I cannot answer that. But what I know is this: for 40 years I understood the world through maps. And this map is as real as any I have ever drawn. Perhaps more real. Because this map was drawn with love, and things made with love are, I believe, more enduring than those made without it. Eleanor will find these notebooks. When the time comes, she will come to this house, sit at this table, and read. And having read, she will understand. She will learn the map's language. Perhaps she will continue. Perhaps she will add something of her own observations, her own sense, her own sounds. Or perhaps she will simply allow the map to continue on its own and watch. Both choices are correct. There is something I have not said enough. And I am not certain I have the words for it even now. But I am writing it down so that it is somewhere, so that it does not go entirely unsaid. Eleanor was always the best observer in this family. I knew this from the time she was very young. When she looked at things, at people, at places, at the world, she looked properly. She noticed. And noticing is the most important thing a cartographer can do. The map does not need to be finished. It only needs Eleanor to see it. Eleanor closed the final notebook. The way one closes something that is complete, that has said what it needed to say and can now rest. She placed it carefully on the table and sat for a long time in the lamplight, surrounded by Edmund's notebooks, before Edmund's map, in Edmund's study. She was not thinking, or the word thinking was perhaps too active for what was happening inside her. It was more like permeability. Allowing feelings and ideas to pass through without grasping at them. The kind of noticing Edmund had described. A state of attention that does not seek or demand but simply receives, the way a field receives rain, without opinion, without resistance, allowing what comes to soak in at whatever depth it reaches. She thought about all the things Edmund had not said during his life. The compliments he had not paid, the affections he had not expressed, the pride he had not announced. He had been, in this as in everything, a man of restraint. Not cold, never cold. But private, in the deep English sense of the word, where feelings are not absent but simply not displayed, where love is expressed through constancy rather than declaration, through showing up rather than speaking up. And yet here, in his notebooks, in the careful small script she had watched move across pages since childhood, he had said everything. Not to her face. Not in a letter. In a notebook, left on a table, in a study, in a house at the end of a lane in Devon, waiting for her to find it when the time was right. This was Edmund's way. Not dramatic, not romantic, not even particularly demonstrative. Simply precise. He had placed his words where they needed to be, and he had trusted that the right person would find them at the right moment. Edmund had seen her. In moments she had not known about, in ways he had never expressed aloud. In his regular letters. The work continues, and I hope you are well. Eleanor understood now that this had not been merely a sentence. It had been a connection. Each month, each letter, Edmund saying, I am still here, I am still working, I am still waiting for you. And Eleanor had replied each time, briefly, as was her way, I am well too, I hope your work goes well, and she had thought that sufficient. Perhaps it was sufficient. Perhaps it was not. But Edmund had never asked for more. He was a man who understood waiting. A man who knew that some things arrive only when the conditions are right, and that hurrying conditions is a form of interference. She made tea. She carried the cup back to the study and sat with it warm in both hands, the steam rising and vanishing in the lamplight, leaving nothing behind but the faintest impression of having been. She drank slowly, the way Edmund had always drunk his tea. With attention, without haste, as though the act of drinking were itself a form of observation. She looked at the map. The line at the eastern edge had grown again. A distinct bay was forming now, a curved indentation in the coastline, the kind of sheltered harbour where small boats might anchor on stormy nights. The line had been drawn with that same steady hand, that same particular ink, while Eleanor had been reading the notebooks, absorbed in Edmund's words, not watching the map at all. The map, it seemed, preferred to work unobserved. Like Edmund himself. Like the quiet people who do their most important work when no one is looking. Eleanor straightened. She opened the table drawer. Inside, Edmund's ink bottle, half full, black, that particular black. His pens, fine-nibbed, precise, a cartographer's instruments. And a blank notebook. Dark green, cloth-bound, the spine unmarked. Eleanor took the notebook. Opened it. Looked at the first page, white, clean, waiting. She dipped the pen in ink. The ink was cool on the nib. She noticed the smell of it, that same sharp, mineral scent that had greeted her when she first entered the study, the smell that had no reasonable explanation and required none. The pen felt right in her hand. Not because she was a practiced writer, she was not, but because the pen itself seemed to know what it was meant for, the way certain tools do when they are picked up by the person they have been waiting for. And she wrote. November the 30th, 1901. First day. I have read the notebooks, all 14 of them. I have studied the map. The eastern coastline continues to draw itself, and I am not looking for an explanation. Edmund would not have looked for one. He would simply have recorded what he observed. She paused. Then continued. The smell of ink in the study is still fresh. I note this because Edmund taught me to observe. To notice, to record, to allow a thing to be fully what it is before deciding what it means. The map is unfinished. Perhaps it will never be finished. Perhaps it should not be. An unfinished map is an invitation. Come, it says, and look. I have come. I am looking. She wrote one more line. I am adding something to Edmund's record, my own observation. This morning, when I looked at the bay in the southwest corner of the map, I received, for a very brief moment, the smell of salt. Sea salt. In the study, in late November, with the windows closed. Edmund was right. Some knowledge arrives before logic. And some things, once noticed, cannot be unnoticed. They can only be continued. She closed the notebook. She placed it beside Edmund's notebooks on the table. 15 notebooks now. 14 on the shelf, 1 on the table. And on the table, the map, unfinished but growing. Incomplete but continuing. In the lamplight, the ink lines on the map seemed almost to glow. Coastlines curved and mountains rose and rivers flowed, all on paper, all in ink, but somehow, in this room, in this light, in this moment, they appeared to be more than marks on a surface. They appeared to be alive. A place breathing quietly in the warmth of a lamp on a November night. Eleanor walked to the window. Outside, the Devon countryside was dark and the stars were out, November stars, cold and clear and very far away. The garden was a shape in the darkness, the trees darker shapes within it. And far off, a farmhouse window, small and yellow, still burning. She thought Edmund spent 40 years mapping the visible world. Then 15 years mapping a world that could not be seen. And both worlds, the visible and the invisible, had been drawn with the same attention, the same love, the same steady hand. She thought, the notebooks are the map's language. And I am learning that language. She thought, tomorrow morning, when I come to the table, the eastern coastline will have grown a little further. And I will look at it. And perhaps, I will draw something myself. A hill. A bay. A name. She thought, this is sufficient. This is exactly sufficient. She did not turn off the lamp in the study, the one on the table beside the map. She knew somehow that Edmund had not turned it off either. That he had allowed the lamp to keep the map company through the long hours of the night, that the night was when the drawing continued, when the map did its quiet, unhurried, faithful work. The lamp burned. The map waited. The notebook stood in their row, patient as everything else in this room. The fire in the grate had burned down to embers. Small points of red light in the dark ash, like distant stars seen through haze, still warm, still giving what warmth they had, asking nothing in return. Eleanor went upstairs. The staircase creaked in 2 places, the 3rd step and the 7th, and she noted this the way she noted everything now, with attention, without judgment, simply recording the facts of the house that was becoming, quietly and without announcement, her house. The bedroom was at the front, overlooking the lane. The bed was made with old linen that smelled of lavender and cedar, the scent of careful storage, of things kept clean against an arrival that was always expected, always prepared for. She got into bed. She laid her head on the pillow and listened to the particular silence of a November night in Devon. Not wind, not rain, just the very faint, almost inaudible whisper of the world turning on its axis, the sound that is not quite a sound but a feeling, the knowledge that time is passing and everything is still and the night is doing what nights have always done. She thought about Edmund's study below her, the lamp still burning, the map still spread across the table. She thought about the ink. That living, impossible ink, still fresh after 19 days, still carrying the scent of mineral and intention. She thought about the pen in the drawer, the blank notebook on the table, the empty chair pulled up to the desk. Everything arranged. Everything ready. Everything waiting with the patience of things that have been prepared by someone who understood that preparation is its own form of love. She thought about the map, that impossible, beautiful, utterly Edmund map. A place that existed nowhere and everywhere. A place drawn from the corners of vision, from the spaces between real things, from the particular attention of a man who had spent his entire life looking at the world and finding, always, more than what was supposed to be there. Before sleep came, one last thought, Edmund's sentence, from every letter he had ever sent her. The work continues, and I hope you are well. She understood now. The work was continuing. It would continue. And Eleanor was well. For the first time in a very long time indeed, she was genuinely well. Not merely functional, not merely adequate, but well in the deeper sense, the sense of a person who has found the thing they were meant to find, the place they were meant to be, the work they were meant to continue. And downstairs, in the study, in the warm light of the lamp, on the table, the map continued. The eastern coastline advanced. Slowly, patiently, with that particular attention that belongs not to haste but to devotion. One more point, one more line, one more curve. Ink meeting paper and drying and being joined by more ink, from wherever it came, from whatever source fed it, quietly and without explanation. And the notebooks, 15 of them now, sat on the table and the shelf in their dark green covers, the years written on their spines, Edmund's voice on their pages, Eleanor's voice on the newest one. A language. A conversation. One that had begun and had not ended and had no intention of ending. A thread between two people, one still breathing, one no longer, that had not broken when one of them stopped. Because some threads are not made of presence. They are made of attention. And attention, once given truly, does not expire. The night deepened. The Devon countryside slept. The stars turned very slowly, very patiently, not at the speed of people but at the speed of places. The hedgerows held their silence. The stone walls ran along the hillsides in their long patient lines, each one built by someone who was long past remembering, each one standing still. The farmhouse window in the distance had gone dark at last. The robin was somewhere in the garden, tucked into whatever shelter robins find on cold November nights, its red breast hidden, its small round body conserving warmth against the morning. And in the study, in the lamplight, the map continued. Silent, steady, completely itself. A place. Mapped and being mapped. Seen and continuing to be seen. The eastern coastline advancing inch by inch, bay by bay, headland by headland, with the unhurried certainty of something that knows it has all the time in the world and intends to use it well. The way flowers bloom. The way rivers flow. The way things happen when someone looks at a place and truly sees it. The way a map grows when it is drawn with love. The way a conversation continues when both parties understand that silence is not absence but simply another way of speaking. The way a lamp left burning in an empty room is not waste but faith, the quiet, stubborn, entirely reasonable faith that someone will return to the light, and that the light should be ready when they do. Good.